Hey folks, I hope you're all well. Welcome back. I do apologise for the tardiness of this particular project. I had a lot less free time than I'd anticipated, but we'll just discuss that in another video, I think. We'll get into the video, because obviously you guys are here to see the results of the project and what the double legendary sims are looking like. And let's face it, people are probably interested for me to put my money where my mouth is and see if any of my theory crafting came through, like whether or not Necrolords might have a shot. So let's open things up and swap to the off screen quickly. The experiment parameters then. For consistency basis, I used the Divine Purpose as opposed to the Seraphim bug. Yes, I know Divine Purpose is an RNG talent, so is pretty shit. So as a result, I had to do lots and lots of iterations of this to try and average out the Divine Purpose procs, but I felt that was probably a more consistent and reliable basis for which to do this, rather than trying to use Seraphim or just having a dead talent, because the two-piece still, or at the start of the experiment, still does, unless, you know, it's been an unknown change, because I can't find any information anywhere about it. The whole applying Seraphim to yourself for 15 seconds, getting an Art of War proc immediately, and it's now 2 seconds. Enjoy, you've just wasted 3 holy power. Didn't really feel great to play around with, so hence the Divine Purpose pick. The item level that I stayed at consistently across the board was 252, so it was pretty close to where I'm at currently, because my Paladin on live is 247 or 249, depending on his gear set. And I was only testing the 4 pieces with the legendaries and kind of that build. I didn't want to be running the max item level gear I could, because I felt like that would skew the results, and playing close to home kind of gives us an inkling of like, okay, this feels great, this feels shit, and oh fuck, we're screwed. So going into it then, observations. First and foremost, the 4-piece, yikes. The RNG element behind it means that it will change the way we play, and the fact that better Ret Paladins are going to have to consciously try and hover around 2 to 3 holy power at any given moment, purely so that we can quickly spend what holy power we have, and then immediately Wake of Ashes. Because a Wake of Ashes buff by Seraphim does nearly double, on average, does nearly double the damage that it would do otherwise. And that is huge for a global. Like, it is a considerable amount of global damage. To the point where, like, Blade of Wrath with Seraphim hits for maybe 9, 10k. If you're lucky. The Wake of Ashes buffed by Seraphim were hitting for somewhere between 19 and 25k. Which is huge single target. Which means that should there be any adds, any cleave moments, it becomes even stronger. So that is going to have a slight shift in our rotation, but the other observation is the fact that haste, especially early on, is going to be a lot more valuable to us than it is currently. Like, you have that quote-unquote 21.5% breakpoint for execution sentence, so you can get the extra globally. But now we're looking at wanting that. We're wanting as much haste as we can get, because we're looking at gaming Art of War procs through Blade of Wrath, through Zeal, and also through the use of things like Wind Fury Totem, and just any kind of haste amp that we can get. So anyone that's lucky enough to have an Old Warrior Soul currently, keep it. And maybe pray that you can get yourself a mythic one sooner rather than later. And if you can't, looks like you're keeping the heroic one going into the next tier, unless they have a nice haste proc or haste amp trinket that I don't know about. It does mean that the trinket from, I think it's Spires of Ascension, the haste on the ground effect, might actually come into play for us and be huge. But anyway, so discussing the talents then. So you can see the Divine Purpose picked here. The general talent iterations varied across talents 1, 2, and 6, or 7 rather. So we basically went from 111 to 121, then or 112, 113, 121, 122, 123, and then so on through this iteration, which resulted in our kind of collective data sets, going back to the off screen. Now, we're just going to bounce backwards and forwards here, because again, I want to try and keep this video really, really short for you guys. So, starting with the Kyrian stuff then. So, we've got 1, 1, and 1. Swap into this. The legendary that won this particular talent setup was Final Verdict. One thing I will say is, although I did test Magistrate's Judgment, it did not win at any point through any of these talent setups. It came second pretty much every time, which means that it is going to be a consistent choice that you can use. Things may change when we're playing with Seraphim again, and they do fix the bug, because end of the day that means we are spending a lot of holy power, and being able to reduce the cost of it might help our rotation slightly. But again, I can't really see Magistrate's Judgment winning out at any point. Not even in Mythic Plus. I see Tempest of the Lightbringer being the second legendary of choice, regardless of which covenant we're running. So, Tier 1, or essentially Talent Set 1, Final Verdict 1, and would proceed to win any setup here, and only lost when we ran this particular setup within the first lot with Zeal. Now, the reason it lost here is because Relentless Inquisitor gives us that 5% haste, and I was talking that haste is now our priority. So having 5% additional haste with Zeal and Blade of Wrath affecting our Art of War proc chance to 100%, it just meant that we had considerably more procs going forward. That also kind of meant that we also had more Divine Purpose procs, because we were getting more Art of War procs, which meant more Holy Power, which meant more spenders into more of these procs. And remember, Divine Purpose can proc off itself as well. So there were points where I was getting 2 or 3 chain Divine Purpose procs whenever I was testing stuff. So again, it is kind of RNG, and I have tried to average it out. But I would also like to point out that this particular build with Righteous Inquisition, or Relentless Inquisitor, also netted the highest overall DPS across all my iterations at 8.2k. Now, and another thing with the experiment, there were no raid buffs and no consumables used at all. This was basically, you've woken up, you've rocked out, you've walked straight into the game, you forgot to do everything else. What's your DPS like? Enjoy. And the reason I did that is because I thought that was probably the safest bet, and also a little bit of ease. I do not have a warrior friend that can buff me, or a monk that I can sit in a group with and get that 5% damage buff off, or a demon hunter for that matter, because you've got to remember a lot of our damage is holy. You know, we're one of the few melee that actually need demon hunter to do DPS. Yay! Anyway, so this particular talent setup actually won out with Relentless Inquisitor. Going into Righteous Verdict and testing that particular setup with these 3, we ended up in a situation where Final Verdict won out until, again, we got to this incarnation. And once we got to this incarnation with Sanctified Wrath and Blade of Wrath, Relentless Inquisitor won out again, because, again, the speed of the rotation and being able to maintain Righteous Verdict better and kind of feeding into things. Blade of Wrath really needs haste, and that's kind of the takeaway from this while we're playing it. And the concern, or the big concern for a lot of people, is the fact that Blade of Wrath, and as we get more haste, the more Art of War procs we get and the more Wake of Ashes we get. Again, I did a video talking about the mathematical value that we could get from this. We may actually see Imperium Power die out in Mythic Plus as well because of Blade of Wrath. Because we are getting more Out of War procs, more Wake of Ashes, and mathematically in dungeons you are looking at then getting 2 Wake of Ashes within a pack. And if you use them the moment you have Seraphim, then you're going to be doing like 20 to 25k worth of damage to everything you hit, which is going to be huge for Paladins anyway. So that pretty much kind of covers the Necrolord stuff, the Kyrian stuff. One exception to the Blade of Wrath incarnation where Righteous Inquisitor was winning was the Execution Sentence Final Reckoning build. So the traditional 1 minute build that we all know and love. Final Verdict won here, and that is purely down to the fact that the damage provided by Execution Sentence Final Reckoning, paired with the damage bonus for the Final Verdict gives to Templar's Verdict, meant that rather than having the 2-minute damage profile that we were having with our other builds, this 1-minute damage profile is still getting more benefit. So whereas the DPS for Paladins at the moment is looking like we peak at the 2 minutes and then just gradually fall down until the next 2-minute mark, we're able to kind of plateau and stabilize ourselves off at the minute mark because we have these cooldowns again. However, I would like to point out that it was incredibly close. Like, running Fires of Justice, there was only 100 DPS difference between Final Reckoning Final Verdict, and Righteous Inquisitor, and with the Blade of Wrath, there was only a 200 DPS difference in my averages. So very, very, very close, but still, the winner is the winner. Now, talking into the Necrolord stuff, I found out very, very quickly that the Necrolord build, regardless of which first talents you're using, does not play well with Fires of Justice particularly well. Like, to the point where the first builds that we were using, where we were only changing these bottom 3, the DPS was 6k and hovering around like 6.1, 6.2, regardless of which legendary I was using. And to put that into perspective, playing this same build as a Kyrian was netting me high 7s to 8k DPS. So you're losing about 1,000 DPS here. And I think that's because Fires of Justice doesn't really play well. Like, we don't need the Crusader Strike cooldown reduction, nor do we need it to have a 15% chance to give us essentially a Magistrate's Judgment and reduce the holy power cost of something. Because we have Vanquish's Hammer, a 30-second cooldown, 2 charges with the legendary, rolling charge where it gives us a holy power and causes us to have a free Divine Storm spender whenever we then Templar's Verdict twice. So we get 2 free spenders for it, which kind of meant that staying with Blade of Wrath kind of became the play. So, first particular setup, interestingly enough, this particular talent build, regardless of which of these 3 bottom talents we played, the winner was Final Verdict. And even then, Final Verdict just won out with Crusade, to the point where it was 7.2 to 7k DPS in favor of Final Verdict. Interesting thing about Crusade, though, Crusade with Relentless Inquisitor, things play very, very fast and are quite fun, but unfortunately we still are that 2 damage profile, and although the burst can be insane, like I was getting 21, 22k DPS bursts, it then obviously drops off incredibly quickly. And you've got to remember, this was without raid buffs or anything like that, so I could have probably hit a little bit higher had I been fully buffed and consumable. The second set of data for Necrolord kind of won out as Relentless Inquisitor, particularly this setup here. Now, the interesting thing with this setup is this particular setup with Righteous Verdict, Blade of Wrath, Divine Purpose, and Sanctified Wrath, which is one of the builds I theory crafted early on, pulled 8k DPS, which pulls in line with several of the Final Verdict builds, especially after my data testing, pulled in line with the 1 minute build that we know and love at current with the 4-set bonus and Final Verdict. So if you don't want to play the 1 minute build and you want a consistent build, Relentless Inquisitor, Necrolord might be the way to go, because it plays very quickly and it does rely on high uptime. So if you have a very static patchwork fight, then this is going to feel good to play because you can just kind of sit there and you can pump. The problem is, though, if you end up having to pull out of melee range for longer than, say, 3 or 4 seconds and you haven't planned for it, you're going to suffer, because that means Righteous Verdict is going to drop and you need to try and maintain like a 99, 100% uptime on this thing, or as close to as possible, because every consecutive Templar's Verdict is going to be 15% stronger, and you maintain that buff. So the first one isn't the first one applies the buff, and then every other one after that is going to be empowered. So very, very, very fun to play with, but will be very punishing if we have high movement fights, at which point Kyrian will then win out. Now, the execution sentence setups. The winner here was, surprisingly, Righteous Inquisitor, or Relentless Inquisitor again. I keep saying righteous. And this, I think, is because of the speed in which we play. It was only 100 DPS difference in it, between it and Final Verdict, and that 100 DPS is going to be flipping negligible by the time we actually get gear. Because once we've got the gear and we've got more haste, and we're trying to like sit around maybe 30-ish% haste, maybe 32, before kind of food buffs and externals and consumables, just because of stat weights. Like, you get 2 haste heavy rings, maybe a couple of gems, and you'll be golden. Then we'll be looking at running Final Verdict all the time. I think the Relentless Inquisitor is going to help early on, because we're trying to gain Blade of Wrath and Art of War in particular. And the fact that our build relies so heavily on that really sucks. Ideally, at this point, I think I'd agree with the rest of the community and say that we need help. We need a rework. The set just isn't great when it's been played with for as long as I've been playing with it. It gets very frustrating very quickly. So, summary then, in terms of the legendary sims and where things sit. You have Final Verdict versus Relentless Inquisitor. They're your 2 choices for single target, with Final Verdict eking out in most cases, and Relentless Inquisitor primarily holding its own because we need more haste. If I had a different gear set with higher haste rings or whatever, then maybe I could have tried to play around with it and see if I could gain that 5% haste elsewhere, and then kind of compared the 2 builds. But unfortunately I don't, and it's something I will try and keep an eye on going into live, or if anyone else is able to test it for me, then please crack on and do so, and let me know in the comments below what you guys think. In terms of Necrolord versus Kyrian though, it's very much in the air, and they are very much close to one another. Marginable DPS. We're going to be looking at Necrolord for 2 targets. Kyrian is going to eke out single target and for 3 target plus. So we may see situations where you're bouncing between the 2, or it's going to be a case of just play what you're comfortable with. Worst case scenario, we may be going Night Fade just to buff the Warlocks or the Boomies. But I will leave that to you guys and your raid leaders to discuss. Hopefully you guys have liked the video. Please comment and like below if you have, or you can thumbs down it into, being the Earth's core if you haven't, and let me know what I could do better next time. In the meantime though, I will catch you in the next video where we will discuss what's going on IRL and what that means for the channel and streaming. Because unfortunately, shit's hectic my end. Catch you in the next one, folks. Take it easy.